President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has further solidified his iron grip over Turkey, as opposition leaders warn democracy no longer exists in this key NATO member. Turkey held a snap election on June 24th, a vote that Erdogan himself had called early in order to expand his powers in the new presidential system he created. This newly granted authority gives Erdogan unprecedented control over Turkey's legislature and judiciary. For the snap election, the Turkish president's ruling right-wing Islamist Justice and Development Party, known by the acronym AKP, formed a coalition with the fascist far-right National Movement Party, or MHP. On the day of the vote, the government cracked down on dissent, and numerous critics of Erdogan were imprisoned. And still, in the end, Erdogan's coalition only got just over 52% of votes. This is a loss of the share of the vote Erdogan had in 2015. Yet this victory will still grant 64-year-old Erdogan, who has been in power for 15 years, 5 more years in power, and he could now run for another term. The Real News spoke with Turkish activist Aral Balkan, who warns that the few remnants of democracy that remain in Turkey are on the verge of extinction.
One-man rule. It is basically one-man rule. But this has been something he's been constructing for the last 10, 15 years. It's just the icing on the cake for the sort of autocratic regime that he's been building. And this was, as I see it, this was the last chance in a while for actually protecting democracy in Turkey, whatever semblance of it is left. Because you have to remember, going into this election, this is not a fair election. Muharrem İnce, the CHP, the head of the party who was running against him in the presidential elections, he said this as well. He said, "I accept the results of the election," because they had their own independent count, and it pretty much matched. There was some ballot stuffing going on, but he said it wasn't enough to sway the election, that he's convinced it wasn't enough. But he said it wasn't a fair election. That's how he began, and these things are not mutually exclusive. It wasn't a fair election. You don't go into an election under a state of emergency having, imprisoned over 100,000 people following a coup, which may or may not have been a coup, which really played into his hands. He couldn't have orchestrated it better if he had orchestrated it. And having the greatest number of journalists in jail in the world, over 100 media outlets that have been shuttered or put into state control, with full control of the media. This is not a fair election. The very fact that, one of the opposition candidates was able to drum up so much support within such a short amount of time maybe is a reason for hope for the future.
Erdogan's main presidential opponent, Muharrem İnce from the centrist secular Republican People's Party, or CHP, got 31% of the vote in the presidential election. In response to the results, İnce declared, quote, "Turkey has cut off its links with democracy." Meanwhile, the leader of the left-wing pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, known by the acronym HDP, ran for president from inside a Turkish prison. Selahattin Demirtas was arrested in 2016, along with other leaders of the HDP, when Erdogan launched a massive purge of tens of thousands of his political opponents. Despite this repression, the HDP still earned 12% of the parliamentary vote in the election, putting it at just over the 10% threshold needed to stay in parliament. Aral Balkan spoke about the Turkish government's brutal oppression of the Kurdish minority.
One of the presidential candidates was running from prison. I don't know how much more it takes to become a banana republic. But Selahattin Demirtas, a person that I have utmost respect for. If you've ever watched any of his talks, it's just the complete polar opposite of Erdogan. Here is an educated man. Here's someone who is, you can see that he cares. You can see that he has progressive values. But that's something that I see in the Kurdish population in general. And you have to remember, I come from a Turkish background. And this is an issue in Turkey. This is a really big issue. So I wasn't brought up there, but I did study. We went back, and that was a culture shock. But I studied high school in Turkey, and I was indoctrinated. They attempted to indoctrinate me into kind of the Turkish way of thinking about things. And you're kind of there's rote memorization in the educational process, and you learn about Ataturk's in his program for change, and during that whole process, it's a latently kind of racist curriculum in a way, where you don't think about it. I wasn't thinking about it back then. I was just kind of accepting that, Kurds probably terrorists. Yeah, you just don't think about it. And I do come from a privileged background, having been a third culture kid growing up in Malaysia, etc. So I was a brat as a kid as well. But I never really thought about it. I just kind of assumed, yeah, Kurds, terrorist organization, PKK. You just kind of hear these things, and you don't necessarily think about them. But it creates this horrible kind of latent, and maybe not so latent, racism and xenophobia against Kurds. And now, kind of looking in, and having had relations with Kurdish people, like I go to Berlin, and every time I have a great conversation with someone who speaks Turkish, it's usually a Kurdish person of the Kurdish community, and I've really started to see the difference. And seeing Demirtas kind of preaching tolerance and democracy and feminism, and along with the other members of his party, it's just so inspirational. It makes me feel terrible as well, because I know where this is taking place. I know where Rojava is. I know where, it's this kind of little tiny flame of hope within a lion's den. And so I have a lot of feelings around this issue, but it's been, and for me, a personal journey as well to come to this realization, over many years. So yeah, I'm very, very, I don't know if I have a right to be proud of him, but I'm very proud of him, and I'm really glad that he exists.
Erdogan's fascist coalition partner, the Nationalist Movement Party, or MHP, also won 11% of the seats in parliament. Its leader called this a, quote, historic success. Aral Balkan warned that this is reflective of a larger global surge in fascism, and that the right-wing racist authoritarianism dominating Turkey is symptomatic of not just domestic, but also international problems.
I've been looking into the news around the votes that MHP got, the fascist party, and it's a lot of people are saying that it's inexplicable, really, how they managed to get that number as part of the elections. But it's not a good thing, right? I mean, we're talking about a coalition between a fascist party and an Islamist party, and that's like a fascist party and a fascist party. I don't see the difference there, really, to be honest. Different shades of fascism. I don't know. Is it 50 shades of fascism? None of this is good. This is not a progressive movement in any way. And so, what can I think about it? It's the worst possible outcome. It's the outcome we have. I watched the press conference that Muharrem İnce held on the morning. And he says he's going to fight on. And I think that's all any one of us can do. Things aren't looking good in Turkey, but things aren't looking good in the US. Things aren't looking good in the UK. Things aren't looking good in a lot of places. So maybe this is our opportunity to say, well, okay, you know what? This is what we have to work with. So let's make the best of it. Let's resist. Let's do whatever we can to change this going forward. There's no place for hopelessness here. If anything, we should have an invigorated fire, in our bellies to go forward and change this, because this is not acceptable.
Reporting for The Real News, I'm Ben Norton.